In Lansing, Michigan, during the spring of 1930, the world welcomed 4 identical baby girls. And with them arrived a darkness that would haunt American psychiatry for nearly a century. Instant celebrities, the Morlock Quadruplets saw their angelic faces grace newspapers from coast to coast. But a house of horrors lay behind that carefully orchestrated public image, a reality that would drive all 4 sisters to madness by their 24th birthday. On Lansing's east side, what really happened inside that small clapboard home? And why, for decades, did government researchers study these women while deliberately ignoring the Nazi sympathizer who terrorized them? Sealed for decades in government archives, the case files reveal a story so disturbing that even hardened psychiatrists struggled to document the full scope of their discoveries. Into what appeared to be a loving American family, 4 identical children were born, only to be systematically destroyed by a father whose obsessions with racial purity and patriarchal control created a laboratory of psychological torture, making his daughters famous for all the wrong reasons. Before the story of the Morlock family and their tragic descent into what scientists would later call dire birth continues, make sure to subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments what state you're watching from. Because this American nightmare could have happened anywhere. Hidden in plain sight, the warning signs were there, in a community that chose to look away rather than confront the darkness growing behind white picket fences. In the Lansing State Journal on May 19, 1930, the birth announcement that would change everything appeared. But the decades of exploitation and suffering that would follow were something few could have predicted. Caught between 2 worlds was Lansing in 1930. Above tree-lined residential streets where American dreams were supposed to flourish, its smokestack skyline rose. During the automotive boom, the capital of Michigan had grown rapidly, drawing families like Carl and Sudie Morlock from across the Midwest with promises of steady work and middle-class respectability. For thousands, employment was provided by the Oldsmobile factory, its assembly lines running day and night to meet the growing demand for automobiles that symbolized American prosperity. The social stratification of the era was reflected in the city's neighborhoods. The professional class, doctors, lawyers, and factory managers, lived on the west side in substantial Victorian homes with manicured lawns and wraparound porches. Home to factory workers, recent immigrants, and families still climbing toward respectability was the east side, where the Morlocks would eventually settle. Here the houses were smaller but well-maintained, their owners taking pride in clean windows, fresh paint, and gardens that bloomed with the same flowers their neighbors chose. With his German immigrant mother, Bertha, Carl Morlock had arrived in America as a young boy, a woman who filled his head with stories of Germanic superiority and warnings about the corruption of American society by inferior peoples. Haunted by her own demons was Bertha Morlock. In her late teens, she had suffered what doctors called a nervous breakdown, spending 3 years in and out of psychiatric institutions. Like a poisonous inheritance, the experience left her with paranoid delusions about racial contamination and conspiracy theories that she passed on to her son. At the Oldsmobile plant, Carl worked as a laborer. His authoritarian demeanor and thick accent made him few friends among his co-workers. A man consumed by paranoid obsessions about protecting his family's purity and reputation was how those who knew him described him, though most dismissed his occasional outbursts as the harmless eccentricities of a foreign-born patriarch struggling to fit into American society. A reliable worker, his supervisors noted, but one who avoided social interactions, often eating lunch alone while reading German-language newspapers that arrived weeks late from overseas. Before his marriage, the boarding house where Carl lived was a grim 3-story building that housed 24 single men, most of them immigrants working in the city's factories. Spartanly furnished but obsessively clean was his room, with religious imagery covering one wall and photographs of German landscapes adorning another. Quiet but intense, his fellow boarders remembered him, given to late-night pacing and muttered conversations in German that seemed to be arguments with invisible opponents. Drawn to his serious demeanor and old-world courtesies, Sudie Mueller had met Carl at a church social in 1925. 22 years old, she was the daughter of a railroad worker who had died in an industrial accident when she was 16. Finding herself unwelcome in her stepfather's house, her mother had remarried quickly, leaving Sudie eager for marriage as an escape from an uncomfortable domestic situation. Traditional patterns were followed in their courtship, with Carl visiting Sudie's family home on Sunday afternoons. In the front parlor under the watchful eye of her mother, the two of them sat. During these visits, Carl spoke little, but his attention to Sudie was intense and unwavering. Small gifts he brought her, flowers, chocolates, books of German poetry that she couldn't read but treasured anyway. After 6 months of courtship, when he proposed, Suddy accepted eagerly, seeing in marriage the security and respectability she craved. A modest affair was the wedding, held in November 1925 at St. Matthew's Lutheran Church, attended by Suddy's family and a few of Carl's co-workers. In the church basement, the reception was held, with sandwiches and coffee served on tables covered with white cloths that Suddy had embroidered herself. Attending was Carl's mother, Bertha, but she spent most of the evening sitting alone in a corner, watching the other guests with suspicious intensity. A small apartment above a bakery on Lansing's east side was rented by the newlyweds. A warm backdrop to their early married life was provided by the smell of fresh bread and pastries. Into creating a perfect domestic environment, Suddy threw herself, sewing curtains, arranging furniture, and learning to cook the German dishes that reminded Carl of his childhood. Having married young, she quickly learned to navigate Carl's explosive temperament through careful observation of his moods and preemptive accommodation to his preferences. Markedly different from his public persona was Carl's behavior in private. A facade of respectability he maintained at work and in the community. But at home, his controlling nature emerged fully. He monitored Suddy's activities, questioned her about conversations with neighbors, and established detailed rules governing everything from how she should dress to which radio programs she was allowed to listen to. These restrictions were necessary, he claimed, to protect her from corrupting influences and to maintain proper standards of German-American family life. Limited and carefully controlled was the couple's social life. Suddy was allowed by Carl to attend church services, but he insisted on accompanying her and positioned himself where he could observe her interactions with other parishioners. Friendships with their neighbors were discouraged by him, claiming that most Americans lacked proper moral standards and might expose Suddy to dangerous ideas about women's roles and behavior. When Suddy discovered she was pregnant in late 1929, the complexity of his psychological state was revealed in Carl's reaction. To carry on his family name and prove his virility to the community, he wanted children. But he also feared the financial burden and the attention that children might bring to his carefully guarded private world. As the pregnancy progressed and doctors began to suspect multiple births based on Suddy's rapid weight gain and the size of her abdomen, Carl's anxiety intensified dramatically. A sign of lower breeding, he believed, were multiple births, something more suited to livestock than respectable German-American families. His mother's stories about the importance of genetic purity and the dangers of degeneracy he had grown up hearing, and the possibility of multiple children triggered all of his deepest fears about racial contamination and social judgment. The perfect backdrop for what was to come was provided by the cultural landscape of 1930 America. Deeper into the Great Depression, the country was sliding, making families desperate for any source of income or attention that might provide relief from economic hardship. Increasingly hollow seemed President Hoover's promises of prosperity as unemployment rose and banks failed across the Midwest. An insatiable appetite for child performers had been created by Hollywood, with Shirley Temple becoming the nation's sweetheart and proving that talented children could earn substantial incomes for their families. As symbols of American prosperity and divine blessing, large families were celebrated by radio programs and newsreels. While ideas about genetic superiority and the need to protect racial purity from contamination by inferior bloodlines were quietly promoted by eugenics movements. Earlier than expected, on the morning of May 19, 1930, Suddy Morlock's contractions began. Sharp pains that caught her unprepared as she was hanging laundry in the small backyard behind their apartment. About overtime pay and the need to save money for the coming expenses, Carl had left for work at dawn, muttering when the pains started coming with increasing intensity and alarming frequency. The elderly widow who lived in the apartment below, Mrs. Henderson, heard Suddy's cries for help and immediately summoned Dr. William Henderson, her nephew, who maintained a small practice serving the working-class families of East Lansing. By the time a neighbor had been dispatched to locate Carl at the Oldsmobile factory, Suddy was already experiencing the intense labor pains that indicated imminent delivery. Through streets clogged with morning traffic and construction crews working on Depression-era public works projects, the journey to Edward W. Sparrow Hospital took nearly an hour. In Dr. Henderson's Model T Ford, which had been hastily converted into an ambulance with blankets and pillows arranged in the back seat, Suddy was transported. Throughout the journey, her contractions intensified, and Dr. Henderson began to suspect that this would not be a routine delivery. Lansing's premier medical facility was Edward W. Sparrow Hospital, a 4-story brick building that served the entire central Michigan region. The entire third floor was occupied by the maternity ward, with private rooms for wealthy patients and shared wards for working-class families. A semi-private room that she would share with another woman in labor was where Suddy was admitted, the standard accommodation for families of modest means. In his 30-year career, Dr. Henderson had delivered hundreds of babies, but he had never encountered anything like what he found that evening. Unusually prolonged and difficult was the labor, with Suddy's cervix dilating slowly despite the intensity of her contractions. About the unusual size of the patient's abdomen and the strange patterns they were detecting when listening for fetal heartbeats, nurses began to whisper as the hours passed and evening turned to night. After nearly 16 hours of labor, when the first infant finally emerged, Dr. Henderson prepared for the routine procedures that would follow, cutting the umbilical cord, cleaning the airways, and presenting the baby to its exhausted mother. Instead, clear evidence that more children were coming was what he found himself confronting. With undiminished intensity, the contractions continued, and examination revealed that delivery was far from complete. 20 minutes later, the second baby arrived, followed by a third after another half hour, and finally a fourth child who seemed reluctant to leave the safety of the womb. Remarkably similar to her sisters was each infant, weighing just over 4 pounds with delicate features and wisps of blonde hair that caught the harsh hospital lighting. As if they were already communicating in ways that adults couldn't understand, their cries were synchronized. Of multiple births, Dr. Henderson had heard, of course, but had never encountered quadruplets in his own practice. He knew that such births were extraordinarily rare, perhaps 1 in 15 million deliveries, and that they often resulted in infant mortality or severe developmental problems. However, as he examined each child, he found them to be healthy and well-formed with strong reflexes and clear lung function that suggested they would survive their dramatic entrance into the world. At the hospital, when Carl finally arrived, having been located after a frantic search of the factory floor and several taverns where he was known to drink after his shift, his first words would echo through the corridors and later through the family's tragic history. "What will they think my wife is?" "A dog," he demanded, his face flushed with alcohol and rage. "This is what happens to animals, not to decent Christian families." Glances of disgust and concern were exchanged by the nurses who heard his outburst, but Dr. Henderson quickly ushered the new father into a private room to discuss the extraordinary nature of the births and the care that would be required in the coming weeks. "Mr. Morlock," the doctor explained patiently, "your wife has given birth to 4 identical girls. This is remarkably rare, perhaps 1 in 15 million births. These children are a medical marvel, and they're all healthy and strong." But with a fury that seemed disproportionate to the circumstances, Carl's face had already darkened. With animals were associated multiple births in his mind, with the breeding practices he had observed on farms during his childhood in rural Michigan. The idea that his neighbors would whisper about his wife producing a litter filled him with a rage that would fester for decades, poisoning every aspect of his family's future. In the hospital's nursery, the babies, initially labeled simply as Baby A, Baby B, Baby C, and Baby D, were placed while Suddy recovered from the difficult delivery. By the novelty of caring for 4 identical infants, the nursery staff was overwhelmed, and word of the unusual birth spread quickly through the small hospital staff. By dawn, reporters were already gathering outside the hospital, hoping for photographs and interviews. In the afternoon edition of the Lansing State Journal, the first newspaper coverage appeared with the headline, "Miracle Quadruplets Born at Sparrow," accompanied by photographs of the tiny infants arranged in a row, each wearing identical white hospital gowns. As perfect specimens of American childhood, they were described in the article, which noted that their birth coincided with a period of economic hardship when good news was desperately needed. Immediate and overwhelming was the public response. With visitors, reporters, and curiosity seekers, within hours, the hospital was flooded. With calls from newspapers across the state and beyond, all seeking details about the miraculous birth, the telephone switchboard was jammed. From strangers across the region, gifts began arriving: blankets, baby clothes, toys, and cash donations from families who could barely afford to feed themselves but wanted to contribute to what they saw as a blessing. For a photo opportunity that afternoon, the mayor of Lansing, Harold Thompson, arrived, bringing with him a formal proclamation declaring May 19, 1930, as Quadruplet Day in honor of the city's newest celebrities. He announced that the city would provide the Morlock family with a rent-free house for 1 year and promised that the community would support them through the challenging early months of raising 4 infants simultaneously. To associate themselves with the quadruplet story, local businesses competed. Free milk for the first year was offered by the Lansing Dairy. Matching outfits were provided by Jacobson's department store. And a new automobile large enough to transport the entire family was promised by the Ford dealership. Dr. Henderson and hospital staff were interviewed by radio stations, broadcasting their descriptions of the remarkable birth to audiences across the Midwest. With growing alarm rather than gratitude, Carl watched this outpouring of attention. Public property had become his private family overnight, and he could already sense the loss of control that would define the rest of his life. When a local businessman suggested that the babies could be exhibited at county fairs and civic events, earning significant money for the family, Carl's paranoia about exploitation began to merge with his desperate need for financial security. A community event became the naming of the quadruplets when the Lansing State Journal sponsored a contest, receiving over 12,000 entries from across the Midwest. To suggest names, families gathered around kitchen tables. As school assignments, children submitted entries, and as a patriotic duty, civic organizations treated the contest. From 10-year-old Margaret Sullivan, the daughter of the doctor who had assisted with the delivery, came the winning entry, who suggested Edna, Wilma, Sarah, and Helen, names that formed the acronym EWSH, matching the initials of Edward W. Sparrow Hospital, where they were born. Patterns of control and exploitation that would define their entire existence were established in the first 5 years of the quadruplets' lives. By the practical demands of caring for 4 identical infants, Suddy, overwhelmed, gradually surrendered more control to Carl, who saw opportunity where she saw only exhaustion. The constant attention from strangers, the endless stream of visitors and photographers, and the pressure to maintain their public image created stress that transformed their modest apartment into a stage where privacy became impossible. Completely exhausted, Suddy was the round-the-clock care that the babies required. That she rarely slept for more than 90 minutes at a time meant feeding 4 infants every 2 hours. To the edge of physical and emotional collapse pushed her changing, bathing, and monitoring 4 children who shared every childhood illness simultaneously. As the family's manager and publicist, Carl, instead of helping with childcare, appointed himself, booking appearances and managing the constant stream of requests for photographs and interviews. By their first birthday in 1931, the girls were appearing regularly at local events, carried in a specially designed 4-seat stroller that had been donated by a carriage manufacturer eager for publicity. By Suddy, who worked late into the night creating increasingly elaborate costumes for their public appearances, they wore matching outfits sewn. That the girls wear different colored ribbons, red for Edna, blue for Wilma, green for Sarah, and yellow for Helen, Carl insisted, so audiences could tell them apart and develop individual attachments to each child. To a larger house on East Michigan Avenue, the family moved when the girls were 18 months old, using money earned from their appearances and donations from well-wishers. The house was modest but respectable with 3 bedrooms, a front porch, and a basement where Carl began storing the growing collection of gifts, photographs, and memorabilia related to his daughter's fame. Into what he called his office, he converted one bedroom, where he kept detailed records of every appearance, every photograph, and every dollar earned through the girl's celebrity. That his daughter's fame could open doors that his foreign accent and working-class status had kept firmly closed, Carl had discovered. Using photographs of the quadruplets on his campaign materials with the slogan, "A man who can handle 4 can handle anything," he successfully ran for the position of local constable in 1932. The irony of this message would become apparent only decades later when the full extent of his handling was revealed to horrified investigators. From simple appearances at church socials and community picnics to more elaborate shows featuring synchronized singing, dancing, and recitation of poems that Carl wrote specifically for them, the girls' performances evolved. He spent hours coaching them, insisting on perfect coordination and identical expressions. Any deviation from his script resulted in harsh punishment administered privately where no observers could witness his methods. With obsessive attention to detail, Suddy sewed their costumes, creating increasingly complex matching outfits that delighted audiences and photographers. To move in unison, speak in harmony, and present a united front of sweetness and innocence that masked the growing tensions in their private lives, the girls learned. From the wings or the audience, Carl monitored their performances, ready to intervene if any of them showed signs of independence or spontaneity. Behind the public facade, increasingly erratic and controlling was Carl's behavior. On the girls' bedroom doors, he installed locks, claiming he needed to protect them from outside influences and potential kidnapping attempts. He monitored their conversations with each other, often listening outside their door or questioning them separately about what they had discussed. By Carl, before they were allowed to see it, any mail addressed to the girls was opened and read, and most letters from admirers were destroyed rather than shared. Elmwood Elementary School was attended by the girls, but their experience there was far from normal. Each morning and picking them up each afternoon, Carl insisted on driving them to school, never allowing them to walk with other children or participate in after-school activities. Where he could observe their classroom windows during recess, he positioned himself, claiming he was protecting them from potential harm, but actually monitoring their interactions with teachers and classmates. That the girls seemed unusually fearful of making mistakes and would often glance nervously toward windows as if expecting to be watched was noticed by teachers at Elmwood Elementary. Unless directly called upon, they rarely participated in class discussions, and they showed little interest in forming friendships with their classmates. During recess, when other children approached them, the quadruplets would huddle together, speaking in whispers and looking anxiously toward the school windows where they knew their father might be watching. Her concerns with Carl during a parent conference in 1934 was attempted by Miss Catherine Reynolds, their third-grade teacher. She noted that the girls seemed isolated from their peers and suggested that they might benefit from more opportunities to develop individual interests and friendships. Immediate and hostile was Carl's response, accusing Miss Reynolds of trying to corrupt his daughters with modern educational theories that undermine parental authority and traditional family values. As Carl's paranoia expanded to include neighbors, teachers, and even extended family members, the family's isolation deepened. That emphasized racial purity and strong patriarchal authority, he began expressing admiration for European political movements, collecting German-language newspapers and pamphlets that promoted Nazi ideology. Increasingly vitriolic became his comments about Jewish people, immigrants, and African Americans, though he was careful to moderate his language when speaking to reporters or public officials who might damage his public image. As the girls entered their teenage years, the performances continued, but their content began to shift in disturbing ways. That they perform songs about the importance of feminine purity and obedience to paternal authority, Carl insisted. Himself, he wrote many of the lyrics, compositions that emphasized their role as representatives of American innocence and the dangers that threatened young women who strayed from proper behavior. As they sang these songs, he would watch from the wings, his eyes fixed on their faces with an intensity that made other observers uncomfortable. By 1948, when the quadruplets turned 18, the carefully constructed public image of the perfect family was beginning to show cracks that even Carl's iron control couldn't completely hide. Inconsistencies in the family's public statements and the girls' increasingly strained appearances at community events were begun to be noticed by local reporters who had followed their story for nearly 2 decades. The synchronized perfection that had once charmed audiences now seemed forced and artificial, with moments of discord that suggested deeper problems. The most outspoken of the four, Sarah, who had always began displaying behaviors that concerned those who knew the family. During interviews, she would sometimes start conversations and then stop mid-sentence, staring into space with a look of profound confusion. Increasingly rambling and disconnected became her answers to simple questions, filled with references to watchers and judges that made no sense to listeners. During performances, she occasionally sang lyrics that didn't match those of her sisters, creating discord in the previously perfect harmony that had been their trademark for nearly 2 decades. The youngest by a matter of minutes, Helen, had become almost completely silent in public, speaking only when directly addressed and then in whispers that audiences often couldn't hear. That Helen seemed to exist in a world of her own making was reported by teachers who had worked with the girls during their brief periods of public schooling, often drawing disturbing images of faceless figures and burning houses during art lessons. With symbols that adults couldn't interpret was filled her artwork, eyes floating above doorways, children standing in cages, figures with their mouths sewn shut. What she described as episodes had begun to be experienced by Edna, during which she would become convinced that strangers were following her or that familiar objects in their home had been moved or replaced by identical substitutes. Her paranoia seemed to echo Carl's own obsessions, but where his fears focused on external threats to the family's reputation and purity, hers centered on the idea that reality itself was unstable and unreliable. Examining photographs of herself and her sisters, she would spend hours, convinced that the images had been altered or that the faces looking back at her belonged to strangers. Severe insomnia was developed by Wilma, often staying awake for days at a time while pacing their bedroom and muttering to herself in a language that seemed to be a mixture of English and German phrases she had overheard from Carl's political materials. When she did sleep, she experienced vivid nightmares that she would describe in frightening detail to her sisters, dreams of being trapped in mirrors or performing for audiences of faceless figures who applauded silently with bleeding hands. Increasingly concerned about the girl's mental state, the family's physician, Dr. Morrison, had grown, and had quietly begun researching their symptoms in his medical journals. That all 4 sisters might be developing signs of what psychiatrists were beginning to call schizophrenia was what he found suggested, a condition that often emerged in early adulthood and could be triggered by prolonged stress or trauma. Particularly troubling was the symmetry of their symptoms, suggesting either a shared genetic predisposition or a common environmental trigger that had affected all four identically. When Dr. Morrison approached Carl with his concerns, suggesting that the girls might benefit from psychiatric evaluation and possibly medication or therapy, Carl's reaction was explosive and revealing. He accused the doctor of being part of a conspiracy to destroy his family, claiming that Jewish psychiatrists and communist sympathizers were using mental health treatments to undermine traditional American values and destroy family unity. He immediately began searching for a new physician who would be more understanding of what he called normal family discipline and less influenced by degenerate modern theories. As stories of Carl's increasingly bizarre behavior reached local law enforcement and social service agencies, the community's perception of the Morlock family began to shift. As troublemakers or jealous neighbors who resented the Morlock family's fame and success were dismissed those who expressed concern. With local politicians and business leaders who saw him as a pillar of the community, Carl had cultivated relationships, making it easy for him to deflect criticism and discredit anyone who questioned his methods. In early 1952, when the girls were 22, a traveling psychiatrist named Dr. Benjamin Strauss visited Lansing as part of a speaking tour about advances in mental health treatment. A refugee from Nazi Germany was Dr. Strauss, who had witnessed firsthand the consequences of racial ideology and authoritarian family structures. About the famous quadruplets and their recent difficulties, he had heard rumors, and he made what he thought was a routine courtesy call to offer his professional services. The full extent of his paranoia and his increasingly explicit Nazi sympathies was revealed in Carl's reaction to Dr. Strauss's visit. Calmly the confrontation began, with Carl initially presenting his usual facade of respectability, but it quickly escalated as Dr. Strauss asked questions about the girls' recent behavioral problems and suggested that professional evaluation might be beneficial. Carl accused the Jewish psychiatrist of being part of an international conspiracy to undermine American families and destroy racial purity through psychological manipulation. The confrontation, which occurred on the front porch where neighbors could witness it, included Carl's declaration that Hitler should have finished the job and his prediction that America would soon need its own final solution to deal with racial and moral degenerates. Shaken by the encounter and recognizing the dangerous ideology that was driving Carl's behavior, Dr. Strauss immediately contacted state mental health authorities and local law enforcement. A family in severe crisis with clear evidence of psychological abuse and possible physical harm was described in his detailed report. He recommended immediate intervention and psychiatric evaluation for all family members, warning that delay could result in permanent psychological damage or even physical violence. The morning of April 15, 1952, would forever divide the Morlock family story into before and after. At the small clapboard house on East Michigan Avenue, state mental health investigators accompanied by county sheriff's deputies arrived with legal authority to conduct welfare checks on all family members. By Dr. Margaret Collins, a psychiatric social worker with extensive experience in cases involving family dysfunction, and Detective Raymond Murphy, a veteran police officer who specialized in crimes against children, the investigation team was led. What they found inside would shock even experienced professionals who thought they had seen every form of family dysfunction imaginable. From the outside, the house appeared normal, freshly painted, well-maintained, with a garden that suggested pride in home ownership. But a level of control and surveillance that transformed a family home into something resembling a prison or laboratory was revealed by the interior. Sparse and sterile were the living areas of the house, with furniture arranged to provide clear sight lines from Carl's chair to every other location. The walls were dominated by religious imagery, but closer examination revealed that many of the pictures had been altered with Carl's handwritten additions that transformed biblical verses into justifications for paternal authority and racial purity. At various ages, family photographs showed the girls, but their arrangement followed a disturbing pattern, with detailed notations in Carl's handwriting grouped together images documenting their physical development. The true scope of his paranoid obsessions and his systematic abuse of his daughters was revealed by the basement, which Carl had kept locked and off-limits to visitors for years. A space that had been converted into what could only be described as a surveillance and examination center was found by the investigators who descended the wooden stairs. With hundreds of photographs of the girls taken without their knowledge were covered the walls, images captured through windows, doorways, and mirrors that documented their daily activities with the obsessive detail of a criminal investigation. Chronologically and by subject, the photographs were organized, with separate sections devoted to each daughter's physical development, social interactions, and what Carl had labeled as behavioral anomalies. In various states of undress, apparently taken during what Carl had described to investigators as medical examinations. Some images showed the girls. The systematic nature of this documentation suggested years of covert surveillance that went far beyond normal parental concern. More disturbing were the detailed written logs that Carl had maintained, filling dozens of notebooks with observations about his daughter's conversations, their physical development, their menstrual cycles, and what he described as evidence of their moral corruption by outside influences. A level of invasive monitoring that exceeded even the investigators' worst expectations was revealed by the logs, including detailed records of the girls' bathroom habits, their sleep patterns, and transcripts of conversations they had thought were private. That the logs contained extensive references to Nazi racial theory and eugenics literature was noted by Dr. Collins, with Carl attempting to analyze his daughter's behavior through the lens of genetic purity and racial superiority. He had recorded his observations about which daughter showed signs of degenerate tendencies and had developed elaborate theories about how outside influences were attempting to corrupt their genetic inheritance. An examination table purchased from a hospital supply company was included in the medical facility that Carl had established in the basement, along with instruments that he claimed were necessary for monitoring his daughter's health and purity. That these examinations had become increasingly invasive and frequent over the years was found by the investigators, with detailed charts tracking what Carl called purity measurements and contamination indicators. A locked cabinet that contained additional documentation of Carl's obsessions was discovered by Detective Murphy, including correspondence with white supremacist organizations, Nazi propaganda materials, and detailed plans for what he called protective measures that would be necessary if his family came under attack from racial enemies. Also contained in the cabinet were photographs and personal items belonging to his daughters that appeared to have been taken without their knowledge or consent. Upstairs, additional evidence of their father's comprehensive control over their lives was revealed by the girls' bedroom. Governing every aspect of their behavior, the walls were covered with handwritten rules, from detailed instructions about personal hygiene to elaborate protocols for interactions with strangers. In Carl's distinctive handwriting, the rules were written and covered topics ranging from proper posture during performances to acceptable topics of conversation with outsiders. In locked cabinets was stored their clothing, with outfits selected and laid out by Carl each morning according to detailed schedules that he maintained. That he monitored his daughter's clothing for signs of wear or staining that might indicate unauthorized activities or moral failings was found by the investigators. Even their undergarments were subject to his inspection and approval. Perhaps most disturbing were the journals that investigators found hidden beneath the girls' mattresses, written in a code that took expert cryptographers weeks to decipher. The full extent of their psychological deterioration and their shared delusions about being constantly watched and judged by invisible authorities was revealed by these journals. By the girls as a way of communicating without their father's knowledge, the code appeared to have been developed, but the content suggested that even their private thoughts had been contaminated by his paranoid worldview. Elaborate fantasies about escape and revenge were described in Sarah's journal entries, but also periods of complete dissociation during which she felt like she was watching her life from outside her own body. She wrote about the watchers who observed everything they did and the judges who would punish them for any violation of their father's rules. A sophisticated understanding of her family's dysfunction was revealed in her entries, but also a growing inability to distinguish between her father's surveillance and imaginary observers. A rich internal world of imaginary companions who offered protection from what she called the watchers was revealed in Helen's writings, but also episodes of violent rage that she struggled to control. Detailed descriptions of fantasies involving the destruction of their house and the death of their father were contained in her journal, alternating with expressions of guilt and self-hatred for having such thoughts. Her growing conviction that reality itself was unstable was documented in Edna's journal, with detailed observations about how familiar objects seemed to change when she wasn't looking and how people's faces would sometimes shift into those of strangers. She had developed elaborate theories about parallel dimensions and duplicate realities, suggesting a complete break from consensual reality that had probably been developing for years. Obsessively on themes of performance and perfection, Wilma's entries focused, revealing her terror of making mistakes that might bring punishment from what she described as the judges. Signs of severe anxiety and perfectionism were shown in her writing, but also periods of catatonic withdrawal during which she seemed unable to function normally. When the investigators attempted to interview Carl, the full extent of his delusional system and his complete lack of insight into the harm he had inflicted on his family was revealed in his responses. He insisted that his daughters were being targeted by an international conspiracy of Jewish psychiatrists, communist sympathizers, and racial degenerates who wanted to corrupt American youth and destroy white racial purity. The only thing protecting his daughters from moral destruction was his strict supervision, Carl claimed, and that any problems they experienced were the result of insufficient isolation from harmful influences. He presented detailed theories about how psychiatric treatment was being used as a weapon against traditional American families and how his daughter's fame had made them targets for those who wanted to undermine racial superiority. His Nazi sympathies, which he had previously kept relatively hidden, emerged fully during the interrogation. He openly praised Hitler's policies toward mental patients and proclaimed his belief that America needed similar programs to eliminate genetic defectives and social undesirables. So extreme and coherent were his statements that investigators realized they were dealing not with simple child abuse, but with a systematic implementation of fascist ideology within an American family. His complete inability to recognize his daughters as individuals with their own needs and rights was revealed in Carl's statements. As if they were possessions or experiments, he spoke about them, describing his surveillance and examinations as necessary research into genetic purity and racial superiority. For the psychological damage he had inflicted, he showed no remorse and insisted that his methods were scientifically sound and morally justified. When questioned separately from her husband, Suddy revealed years of psychological and physical abuse that she had endured while trying to protect her daughters from the worst of Carl's obsessions. She described Carl's increasing obsession with controlling every aspect of their lives and his violent reactions to any suggestion that his methods were harmful or unusual. The systematic nature of the abuse and its escalation over the preceding decade was provided by her testimony as crucial evidence. That she had attempted to seek help on several occasions was revealed in Suddy's account, but Carl's position in the community and his skill at presenting a respectable facade had made it difficult for her to convince authorities that serious abuse was occurring. With violence if she disclosed family secrets, she had been threatened, and she lived in constant fear that any attempt to protect her daughters would result in even worse treatment for them. When finally interviewed away from their father's presence, the girls themselves struggled to communicate with their interrogators in ways that revealed the profound impact of their abuse. Unable to distinguish between reality and the elaborate delusional system their father had imposed upon them had left them years of isolation and psychological manipulation. Often contradictory and confused were their responses, suggesting severe psychological trauma that would require extensive treatment. That the girls displayed symptoms of what would later be recognized as complex post-traumatic stress disorder was noted by Dr. Collins, including dissociation, hypervigilance, and an inability to form normal social relationships. So entrenched had their shared delusional system become that they had difficulty accepting that their father's surveillance and examinations were abnormal or harmful. Within hours of the initial investigation, the decision to remove all 4 girls from their family home and place them under psychiatric care was made. On charges of child abuse, sexual assault, and endangerment, Carl's arrest marked the end of the Morlock Quadruplets' public performance career and the beginning of their transformation into the most studied family in American psychiatric history. Through multiple institutions and communities reverberated the aftermath of the Morlock family's collapse, each trying to understand how such systematic abuse could have continued for so long without effective intervention. Fundamental failures in social services, law enforcement, and community oversight that allowed a dangerous individual to maintain a facade of respectability while inflicting severe psychological damage on his children were exposed by the case. In the Quadruplets, the National Institute of Mental Health, newly established as part of the federal government's growing commitment to medical research, saw an unprecedented opportunity to study the relationship between genetics and mental illness. For the Institute's ambitious research agenda, which sought to establish psychiatry as a legitimate medical science with the same empirical foundations as other branches of medicine, the timing was perfect. At NIM, Dr. David Rosenthal, an ambitious young psychiatrist, convinced his superiors that the Morlock case represented a perfect natural experiment that could resolve long-standing debates about the causes of schizophrenia. For genetically identical individuals, all diagnosed with the same mental illness, raised in the same environment. The ideal way to determine whether psychiatric disorders were primarily caused by heredity or upbringing, it seemed. Quickly was the decision to study the quadruplets made, with little consideration for the ethical implications of using traumatized young women as research subjects. The importance of scientific knowledge over patient welfare was emphasized by the prevailing attitudes in psychiatric research, and the girls' consent was considered less important than the potential benefits to medical science. To protect the family's privacy and avoid the sensational media coverage that had defined their early years, the researchers assigned them the pseudonym Genain, derived from Greek words meaning dire birth or dreadful gene. The irony of this name, given the circumstances of their fame and suffering, was apparently lost on the scientists who would spend the next 3 decades studying them as if they were laboratory specimens rather than human beings. To the NIM facility in Bethesda, Maryland, In the summer of 1952, the girls were transported, beginning a new phase of their exploitation that would continue for decades. From their parents and from each other, for the first time in their lives, they were separated, housed in individual rooms where they could begin the slow process of developing independent identities free from their father's surveillance and control. A sprawling complex of modern buildings designed to project an image of scientific sophistication and medical authority was the NIM facility. In a special ward that had been designed for